Did any of the following actually happen as described in these scary stories? Bigfoot versus Dogman. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I've got an old tale for you from my youth that happened to me in Mill Run, Pennsylvania. Assuming you haven't heard of this place, it's located about 60 miles southeast of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, which would be the closest major city. It's almost as far west and south as you can go in Pennsylvania, located 200 miles northwest of Washington, D.C., 250 miles due east of Columbus, Ohio, and 200 miles northeast of Point Pleasant, West Virginia, home of the Mothman, as reported in John A. Keel's classic book, The Mothman Prophecies. Mill Run is a beautiful place in the country, but it's actually somewhat famous internationally, at least to lovers of great architecture. This is because Mill Run is the home of falling water, a building which intertwines with a waterfall in a very unique way. Designed by legendary architect Frank Lloyd Wright, falling water is considered such an important human achievement that it's included in the UNESCO World Heritage List. In fact, it's the first modern architecture in the United States to be included on that list. Falling water was the main reason I was in that area of Pennsylvania on that hot summer night in 1972. I had dropped out of college and began a cross-country trek to, quote, find myself, unquote. A lot of people were doing that kind of thing back then, just wandering off into the wilderness, looking for some sign or some true meaning of life before they settled down into their boring, meaningless 9-to-5 adulthood. Although the world I inherited was vastly different from the world my parents had come from, my generation was still more traditional than now, and once I was done being a hippie, I found myself getting married, having 2 kids, and working endlessly for decades to put those kids through school and college. Although my generation prolonged our adolescence, we did eventually grow up. But this story happened when I was still young and completely open to new ideas. Nothing I encountered really surprised me, and at the same moment, everything I encountered was a huge surprise. Being out in nature entirely alone when you had grown up in a city, you begin to understand how people could come to believe in ghosts and monsters and the true deep power of myth. And it was very near to Falling Water, where I was secretly camping out in these woods that very well may have been privately owned, that I encountered 2 of the greatest myths of all in real life engaged in mortal combat with each other. One of them I had heard of before, although I thought he only lived out in the Pacific Northwest. The other I had never heard of before and would only come to identify 2 decades later. I'm going to tell you the story of the time I saw a very large Sasquatch fighting a turf war with what had to have been the Pennsylvania Dogman. This is how it all started. I was falling asleep in my tent, which was set up in the vicinity of Falling Water, but don't ask me exactly where. This was a long time ago, and I didn't really care where I was even back then. As I said, I was seeking to find myself and all that. Suddenly, I sat straight up in my tent when I heard a scream that they invented the term blood-curdling to describe. I honestly thought that I was hearing someone in extreme pain somewhere. I was too much of a hippie to think I was hearing someone being attacked. I jumped to the conclusion that it was someone who had fallen or injured themselves in some accident. I felt a deep sense of duty to run out into the darkness and help that poor individual. But I sat there frozen for a while, feeling the adrenaline surging through me and also feeling a growing sense of panic. I never again after that night heard this kind of a scream, until very recently actually, when I saw a meme on the internet. I forget what site I saw it on, maybe YouTube. Tell me if you've seen this one. There were 2 cops heading into a graveyard, then they hear a scream like the one I heard that night, and they immediately turned, and ran right back out of that cemetery. This was a scream that could terrify experienced police officers, so imagine how I felt alone in the darkness in a clearing in the woods, hearing that same kind of a scream. As much as my conscious mind was telling me that I was hearing a person in distress who needed me to rescue them, my subconscious must have been feeling that same threat that the cops felt that night. So I pulled my boots on and I pulled myself together. Then I braced myself to head out into the dark night, armed only with my flashlight and my minimalist first aid kit. I unzipped the tent. I climbed outside, and a second blood-curdling scream, this time even louder and definitely coming from the direction of falling water, erupted. My knees literally powered down, and I found myself climbing back into my tent, shivering so badly that I nearly felt like I was getting frostbite on an 85-degree night. Inside the tent again, I ran excuses through my head about why I shouldn't investigate further. Whoever that was screaming, they were over by the Frank Lloyd Wright building. Surely someone over there would hear them and come to rescue them. Surely they had access to better first aid equipment than I had in my tent. I made up excuse after excuse until that same scream erupted again, this time sounding more high-pitched and quite possibly a woman. I don't know if it's still politically correct to feel a sense of responsibility toward the safety of women. Maybe it's more feminist to leave them alone to perish. All I knew is that if I let a woman alone in the darkness who sounded like she was in such a pain, I would have felt guilty, as if I had attacked her myself. I couldn't stop my eyes from tearing up, and I couldn't stop my hands from shaking violently in fear. But I sucked it up, and I went out into that darkness once again, knowing that it would be wrong not to. I knew which way I needed to head, even if I had no idea what I was going to find. I braced myself that there would be more ungodly screams to make me want to jump out of my skin. I told myself that I would not be afraid when the next scream hit. After all, if the screaming got louder, that was a good thing. It meant I was getting closer to where I needed to be in order to rescue that poor woman, whoever she was. I was maybe about 15 or 20 trees deep into the woods when the scream erupted again, even louder than last time. Again, my knees buckled, and I slipped down, grabbing onto a nearby tree to keep from falling on my face. I was very disappointed in myself. I had known I would hear it again. I had psyched myself up to be ready for it, and yet, once that scream came, I had been even more frightened than before. I cursed myself for being so illogical. After all, it was a human being in distress. It's not like I was hearing the cries of a monster after all. I searched around for some time, shining my pathetic early 70s battery-operated flashlight around. I felt I had to call out to the woman, tell her I was looking for her, and hope she called back to give me her location. I knew that was the thing I had to do, but I can't even describe how scared I was to actually do that. I really did not want to give out my location. I was so frightened, but I told myself I was being absurd and silly. I was behaving like a coward, is what I said to myself inside my head. Little did I know that the intense body fear I was experiencing was far wiser than my conscious mind could have been. My inner child, my inner voice, my unconscious, my nervous system, and my body all knew I was in great danger. But my conscious mind had been selected and placed in the president's Oval Office of my brain, and my conscious mind was a complete idiot. And so I walked ever closer toward the exact place I should have been keeping away from. I remember taking a deep breath to call out to the woman out there in the darkness, to ask her where she was and how I could help. The air rested in my lungs, waiting for me to use it for a shout, but instead, I breathed it out quietly, and I began weeping, So upset was I about shouting out into that particular wooded area. I remember clenching my fists and my teeth and inhaling again, this time letting out a weak, "Hello?" I cleared my throat and tried again, louder and with a slightly less shaky voice. "Hello? Is there someone out there?" I heard a sound that I at first took to be a kettle drum or a bass drum coming from behind me. The ground began to tremble under my feet as the heavy, thudding sound grew closer and closer. Whatever that was, it was not a lady in distress. It sounded more like something as heavy as a moose, except it didn't sound like it was galloping. It sounded as though something as heavy as an adult horse were running on its hind legs. Honestly, that was an even scarier thing to hear than the screaming was. I know I was petrified, like I was experiencing a ghost or a devil, something supernatural. It just didn't make sense to me, and my nervous system staged a coup, ousting my conscious mind from the Oval Office and putting my body in charge instead. I found myself running forward, tearing through underbrush, with the underbrush tearing through me as well. Whatever was coming up behind me, it had to be something that wasn't supposed to exist. I had made a huge mistake, and I felt that my life story was about to come to an abrupt end. Tripping over a big tree root that I hadn't seen, I fell face forward onto the grass in a clearing. Everything hurt, especially my face. I pulled myself up enough to begin to crawl forward when the sound of an angry and large dog barking and growling at me made me stop right where I was. Painfully lifting my head to see the dog in front of me, I instead saw only the hind legs of the dog, which was even larger than I had been visualizing. Nothing was making sense. I was in search of an injured lady, but instead I was being chased from behind by an unseen giant, and in front of me was... well, what was in front of me? It took great effort to pull myself up into a position where I was kneeling and looking forward. Sure enough, it was an immense gray dog in front of me, but it was standing up on its hind legs like a man would. I don't even mean like a gorilla or a chimp, since they actually stand hunched over and usually use their front arms to help them walk. This dog in front of me stood fully erect with posture that would have made my first grade teacher proud. When my eyes got far enough up to make eye contact with the beast, I was stunned to see it reflecting back eye shine so brightly that it hurt to look into those eyes. I was not shining my flashlight directly at it, and there was not enough ambient lighting to provide that much eye shine. It almost looked as though the dog's eyes were lit up from inside, but I know things don't work that way. It also had a far wider chest than any dog I've ever seen. Perhaps it was a wolf or some other precursor of our modern pet dogs. It did have ears and a snout very similar to those of wolves, but it had a set of choppers like something out of a horror movie. It looked like it could take down an even larger creature with those teeth alone. I didn't know back then what I was even dealing with. I didn't think that it might be a werewolf because it didn't look like Lon Chaney. I had no awareness of Dogman back then. Very few people did, really. I mean, we're talking about the early 1970s, and this was not Michigan or Wisconsin. All I knew was that once I looked into those glowing white eyes, the big, upright canine became quite offended and barked even louder. It took a few surprisingly steady bipedal steps in my direction, barking louder, snarling, and pulling its lips back to show off its meat-eating teeth. I pointed my head down to the ground, instinctively adopting a submissive pose. I don't think I even knew what that word meant back then, but as I said, my body had deposed my mind and taken over, and my body knew its only chance for survival was to essentially beg that 8-foot-tall carnivore to allow me to live. I bowed my head. I stared at the grass, but I began to accept the worst. My mission of mercy might be about to end with extreme pain, and then... what? I wondered what happens to us after our lives, and I realized I might be about to find out. And then, from behind me, that woman screamed again, causing me and the giant dog to react in surprise. I turned quickly, not having the vaguest idea what I would see. When my eyes focused, I can assure you I was not looking at a woman, in distress or otherwise. I was looking at the greatest mythological creature of my era. I was absolutely certain I was craning my neck upward to see a Bigfoot. This creature did not look like Patty. It was not 6 feet tall, and it didn't have a hairy bra strapped to its chest. It did have a conical-shaped head, but other than that, I was seeing something completely impossible. This could not have been a man in a costume. This was something far more like an ape man, too tall, and with eyes that were not human, but animal. The way it moved was not the way a man moves. Even Rick Baker could not move the way this thing did. It was just nothing like us, while simultaneously seeming just like a person. It is very hard to describe because there is nothing else like what I was looking at. It doesn't compare well to anything in the known record of animals. The Sasquatch man put on a fearsome display of its ferocity, beating on its chest like a gorilla and opening its mouth wide, displaying all of its teeth and gums as well. And then it screamed like an injured woman, and I realized how stupid I had been. I mean, my conscious mind finally connected on what a complete moron I had been acting like. If I had stayed shivering in my tent, I likely never would have been confronted with either of these creatures. They probably would have been curious about my tent and camp, but they also probably would not have come too close to it. I had foolishly walked right into the dark woods alone, and now this Bigfoot was going to, charge past me? That's what it did. It thundered right past me like King Kong Jr., and it got right in the face of that big, upright dog. The two of them were about as evenly matched as a heavyweight title bout, both of them standing roughly the same height, around 8 feet, and both of them seeming to have around the same reach with their very long front arms. Or really, I can just say arms, I suppose, since neither of them was quadrupedal. They both seemed very bipedal. I've read people since then describing Dogman and Bigfoot both as being creatures that can drop to all fours and run more quickly than they can on 2 legs, but I saw none of that on this night. Possibly because they were each trying to frighten off the other. They both stood up as tall as they could and never dropped down to all fours. When the Bigfoot screamed in the Dogman's face, it backed up a few steps, but began barking and whimpering at the ape-man's face in return. Whereas the Bigfoot's posture was confident and threatening, the Dogman appeared more worried. His high-pitched yammering seemed very agitated and threatening as well, but it seemed that he didn't really want to fight something as large as the Sasquatch. Bigfoot was acting like, "Back off or I'll smash you," while Dogman was more like, "If you fight me, we're both gonna get completely messed up. Are you sure you want to do that?" The Bigfoot said yes and screamed louder at the Dogman, who did not back up even 1 step this time. The Bigfoot's shouting was becoming more like a screeching. It sounded less and less like a woman, and more like a baby crying, as bizarre as that might seem. I gathered that both creatures were in an increasingly more agitated state, but my body was still too frozen in fear for me to do anything but watch with my very dulled down and shocked eyes. The Dogman was the first to attempt to actually fight, as it snapped at the throat of the Bigfoot and barely missed. This caused the Sasquatch to react with flailing arms, swinging wildly as its eyes opened to max width, and its screeching grew so loud that my ears were beginning to hurt very badly. The Bigfoot, whose teeth were not human-like at all, but rather as feral and carnivorous as the Dogman, began snapping at the canine creature in a similar way to how it had been snapping at him. Soon, the Bigfoot leaped upon the Dogman, and the two rolled several times over. They spun into a medium-sized tree, cracking the trunk loudly and sending leaves flying in all directions. I was weeping, wishing I could be back in my tent, and then it dawned on me. I actually could be back in my tent. The monster men were preoccupied with each other, and there was nothing preventing me from running back to my camp. I stood up, and blood rushed to my head, dizzying me. I tilted sideways, using a tree for support, and hurting my wrist in the process. The sounds of growling and furious babies screaming was so unnerving that again my body took over and navigated me back to my tent in the clearing. It took me a few tries to zip the tent up once I was back inside because my hands were both shaking so much. I cried like the same baby that Bigfoot's screams sounded like, and I listened as the terrible battle continued in the woods out of my sight. I wondered who would win this turf fight, and I prayed that they would have forgotten about me before their fighting was done. Well, I really don't know what happened after I left, but I do know that eventually the battling quieted, and then I heard the longest, loudest howling I've ever heard in my life. That had to have been the Dogman, and its howl was answered by canines in all directions around me. I don't know if it defeated the Bigfoot, or if the Bigfoot ran away to fight another day. I just know that the Dogman kept howling for what felt like an hour. It was probably more like 5 minutes, but to me it sounded like it was never going to stop. That next morning, I was so shaken up that I actually went and found myself a hotel room to sleep in. I slept all day, and after getting some dinner, I spent the night there too. I seriously considered calling off my ramblings and heading back home, but after getting my strength back, I found I still wanted to go back out there and rough it some more. I found myself camping closer to human habitation or official campsites, and each night before bed, I made a contingency plan for what to do in case of emergency. I actually only gave up when the weather got cold again, hopping on a bus and heading back to my parents' place. Out of all my time in the wilderness, my only time encountering anything weird at all was on that one scary night. In fact, my entire life has been pretty average and mostly boring ever since the time I saw the battle of Bigfoot versus Dogman. We hope you enjoyed that all-new Dogman and Bigfoot story, and now I'd like to give a shout-out to tonight's executive producer, the one and only Avril Barkley. Avril Barkley. We think she's a super Starkly, a star from space. That is, dear Avril, a blast-off from old Cape Canaveral. Please join us in thanking Avril Barkley for helping to make this episode possible. In return, we send her links to see our weekly secret uncensored Dogman stories far too wild to tell on this channel. You can see them too. All you have to do is join our PayPal subscribers club at peterbernard.com the way Avril Barkley did, or you can simply click the join button under this or any of our videos and become a channel member. Here's PQ Rivers' Dr. Death to explain the parts that I've left out. Doctor?
Thanks for watching till the end. If you liked what you saw, please consider clicking like on the video or sharing it. You can become a channel member by clicking the join link below. Then you can check our community page to find the links to 10 hours or more of secret, uncensored Dogman stories too wild to be told on this channel. Your other option is to join our paid subscribers club at peterbernard.com. That's Peter's homemade club, where he will personally email you the links as well as occasional secret club club messages. You may also be included as an executive producer in a future episode. You have a scary experience you want to tell us about? You can email us at scarystoriesnyc@gmail.com, or else call our Scary Stories voicemail hotline at 804-LESS-SCARY. The machine cuts off every few minutes, so if you have a long story, please keep calling back and we'll piece it together later on. Good night, and have a scary tomorrow.
Come back for more scary stories.